Good morning, everybody. Good morning to everybody here who's joining us live on the Buddhist Biohacker, and good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. And welcome in. I'm Lisa Gunshore. I am your host for Buddhist Biohacker, which our mission is creating conscious content for 1111D. So as we step into the new reality, we are the new media. And for everybody who's joining in the live, welcome in. And you can use the live chat to write questions, comments, anything like that. We'd love that if you do that. So please do that. And if you're listening later on iTunes and Spotify and you're getting this on audio, you can join our MeWe forum at MeWe.com, Buddhist Biohacker, and we can continue the conversation there. Another great social media platform that also is about conscious content and not controlling and managing what you say, which is a beautiful thing. And today is one of those days that I have dreamed of, which is a day that we are doing exactly what I want Buddhist Biohacker to do. We started this morning talking about fascia decompression, and now we are going to be talking with Jeff Strong from the Strong Institute. Jeff, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. And Jeff is a renowned drummer turned scientist, and we have so much to talk about. I just can't even stand it. So I'm going to just stop right here and say, why don't you share with everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, well, I'm a drummer. I've been playing drums my whole life. That's been my career. And I got lucky when I was studying music at the Musicians Institute in the early 80s, where I met a teacher who taught me hand drums. But not only did he teach me the hand drums, he taught me where they come from, what the rhythms were and what they were about. And I got an opportunity to learn traditional hand drumming rhythms that weren't part of regular secular music. They were more ceremonial in nature. And that kind of stuck in the back of my head after I graduated school and went on tour with different bands. Spent about a decade touring and then kind of burnt out. And I really needed to find another way of making a living as a musician or doing my work as a musician without being on tour 50 weeks a year, which is what my 10 years were. And I started looking at the traditions that I'd learned from this particular drummer and wondered if there was something to it, because I had this, at the same time I was studying with this guy, I had this weird revelation at school where I was playing around with how I practiced, because at music school, you're not just playing drums, you're having to learn music theory and, all this stuff. And, I'm a drummer. I don't really necessarily care about music theory. And that was the hard stuff for me. I could practice all day long. I could do sight reading exercises. I could do rudiments, all the things that the drummers do to get really good at the act of drumming. But when it came to doing the book work, I have ADHD, by the way, and so I couldn't focus. I couldn't get myself to get the work done, and so I made a deal with myself. I decided that I would reward myself after the book work and do my favorite exercises, which were the sight reading. And sight reading was all about taking a piece of music that you've never seen before and just reading it and being able to read, interpret, and perform it in the way that the composer wanted you to play. And so you're having to really be understanding what you're seeing and deciphering the music and interpreting the music in real time at a pretty good clip. And I said to one of my teachers one day, I said, so what tempo do you think I'd have to learn how to play some of these sight reading exercises to be able to walk into a studio and play, anything somebody might have for me? And what kind of skill level do I need? And he said, well, if you could have your metronome set at 120 beats per minute, and if you were able to play 16th notes, you'd probably be able to handle 95% of the music that came in front of you. And I said, okay, I'm going to do that. I set up my metronome, and I would, it was called Dr. Beat back in the day. And Dr. Beat was a little metronome that you could set the clicks to play at the tempo, 120 beats per minute, which is 2 times a second. So you got this click, 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 click. And then you could bring the subdivisions up in the music. And so it could play the 16th notes for me. It would go da 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 da. And so now I've got this thing in my head going by at 16th notes at 120 beats per minute, and I'm practicing. And I loved that exercise, and I would do that as a reward after doing my music theory work. But that lasted just a little while because with ADHD, I want the reward first so that I can then do the work. So I decided to bring the sight reading exercises first. I would do those for 30 minutes, and then I would jump into the book work. And I was shocked that within the next few weeks, my grades in my music theory class started going up. And I had no idea why. And I'm looking at this as I'm in crisis after touring for 10 years and thinking about what I've learned with the ceremonial drumming and thinking, there's got to be a way to connect this. Because my teacher told me back in the day that the ceremonial drumming was really about healing. It was about, in the traditional context of the style that I studied, the drummer was the mental health care professional. He was the guy who held the community together. It wasn't just about what happened in the ceremony. He also was involved with the people in the community to help them act appropriately, for instance. And he showed me actually in several instances where if there was a community member that was having difficulty, he would go into their house and he would straighten them out by playing for them. And the language back then was used about, it's a very spiritual language about what this would do. And so I was kind of not really comfortable with that at the time, based upon my background. So I kind of shoved that in the back of my head. This experience with the sight reading was in the back of my head. And then I started just thinking, is there something I can do with drumming that might be not putting me on tour? I was doing studio work and that was fine, but I wanted to do something that had more of an impact in the world. And I started thinking about my ADD and looking at that and decided I would do some experiments. So this was about 1991. I started taking this technique, the ceremonial technique that my teacher taught me, and approaching it from the perspective of this experience I had with the sight reading. And what I basically did is I played my drum at the tempo that I experienced my focus get better, which was 120 beats per minute, 16th notes. And I'll get into the actual math of that in a minute. And I decided I would play that tempo for people, and I would play some of these ceremonial rhythms that I played with my teacher in the way that he did when he went in and helped somebody that he was trying to correct their spiritual energy, for lack of a better word. And I went in and started playing for people. I volunteered at a Center for Chronic Pain in Minneapolis called Pathways. And I'd go in there and play for people who had chronic pain. It was a place for chronic illnesses, actually. So chronic pain, any kind of a long-term illness. And I started tracking what kind of experiences people had when I played. And then it turned out that I got to play for some people with developmental disabilities. And as somebody with ADHD, that made perfect sense. Let's see if I can help them focus. Let's see if I can help them calm down. So I go in their living rooms, I bring my drum in and I play my 16th notes at 120 beats per minute. And I start recording these sessions and tracking what people's response were and started seeing some interesting responses. And I spent about 2 years doing that. And then I had an opportunity. I had a student who also was a psychologist at a school where that was focused on autism. And they had one of the most progressive autism programs in the state. This was in the Minneapolis area, St. Paul. And he said, would you like to do a study on this? You can come in and play for the kids in the school. And so we pulled together a study. We got approval from the school board because they were so progressive and they let a drummer come in and play. So I came in and I played them in recordings and basically tracked what happened if somebody listened to recordings once a day of this really fast drumming. 16th notes at 120 beats per minute is a pretty good clip. And we started seeing calm and we were seeing other changes in behaviors. And before you knew it, I finished the study, then word spread. I was asked to speak at the Minnesota Autism Conference, Autism Society. And then I got called from the Center for the Study of Autism in outside of Portland, asked if I'd come and speak at their professional conference, which had 300 of the best known autism researchers in the world. And I got to come and do my paper on how drumming can calm people with autism. Now I'm a drummer. At that point, I was not a researcher. I was just a drummer interested in why I could focus better playing drumming. And it didn't require people to play either, so they got to listen. And before you know it, I'm doing 12, 13 professional conferences a year where I'm speaking about what we're doing. The guy who ran that center helped us design a bunch of double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. We did 3 at once. We did an autism study, we did an ADHD study, and we did a chronic pain study. And then we followed up with more research. Since then, we've done tons of research. I've spoken at a few hundred conferences, sharing our research and talking about the approaches that we use. In 2004, we developed a provider network that offers our programs around the world. We have about 3,800 providers right now that act as our kind of in-person therapists. We also have an online program, all developed out of me playing in people's living rooms because I was interested in why my playing sight reading exercises helped me focus. So that's the short version of where I've gotten where I'm at. I've got a lot of CDs out that do the same approach, and it's just basically fast drumming. And you don't have to play, you just listen. And just listening to the drumming shifts the brain. And that's what we've been looking at. For the last 10 years, we've been looking at EEG on how people respond to different rhythms, different tempos, different approaches. And today I want to talk a bit about how this applies to meditation. Because once you understand the mechanisms involved in this, you can start seeing how you can take something as simple as a mindful meditation and turn it into a transformational experience. And so that's the path that I've gotten to get here. So
that's so amazing. And it's such a testament to that spirit-led life, really following your heart, listening to where you're being guided and allowing it to happen. I think it's that saying yes to where you're going has created so much amazing. I mean, the Strong Institute is amazing. Like, you go to the website and it's so rich with content and information and support and resources to be able to help with your brain. I want to hear all about how drumming and meditation work together, because for years I lead journeys and soul retrievals and things like that, and honestly did a lot of it without drumming until I met my husband, who's a drummer and could do it for me. And so I've seen the difference. I've seen the difference in how it feels to journey somebody, like not even being in the journey, but when you're leading a journey, you're leading an experience for a person or a group of people, having drums versus not having drums, and what I see and what I'm experiencing as I'm leading it. So I'm really excited to dig in to what you have to say about this, because it fascinates me so much.
Oh, I'm glad you have experience with the drumming and the non-drumming, because I think that is really critical. These techniques have been around forever. As a matter of fact, the world's oldest organized healing technique uses drumming. And it's the shamanic technique. It's been around tens of thousands of years. It exists all over the world. It's not cultural. And this is one thing that really started a lot of the wheels turning for me when I started looking at shamanic drumming. And shamanic drumming is a really simple technique. The shamanic practice is a very in a lot of ways, very simple approach, but you'll find it everywhere in the world, and it doesn't require any cultural aspects. There's parts of it that are, and I'll get into that in a second, but primarily the mechanisms, the core components of what's called core shamanism is universal around the world, and it doesn't matter where you're from, and it doesn't matter what else you believe. It doesn't matter what other religious aspects there is to it. As a healing modality, it is universal around the world. So, and every time it's got some sort of a consciousness altering mechanism to it. 90+% of the time it's a drum. And then less than 10% of the time, it's way less than 10. I think it's probably even less than 5%. It's some sort of chemical, a psychedelic, ayahuasca, psilocybin, something along those lines. In order to facilitate the journey. And if you look around the world, the way shamanism has come forward, there are certain parts of the world where the drumming got lost at one point. And here in parts of the United States, especially down in the region I'm in the Southwest in New Mexico. A lot of the people who came to New Mexico, a lot of the Europeans who came to New Mexico 300-400 years ago, were fleeing persecution there because they were shamans and they were shamanic practitioners. They were living shamanic approaches, earth-based religions. And when they came here, and sometimes before they came here, they left their drum behind, because the one thing that could be noticed as part of this earth-based tradition is the drum. And so if you're gonna try to squash this movement, and you want to be able to identify those people, especially in Europe, who were practicing these approaches, you'd look for the drummers, because they're the ones that were doing this primarily. And so when these people came to the Southwest, the United States, they left their drums behind, and they're still practicing here today. They're called curanderos, but they're not using their drums, and it's a very different approach, even though the rest of it's the same. And the three components, by the way, of these traditional techniques are the altered state of consciousness with some sort of mechanism, either drumming or chemicals, a focused visualization, and a ceremonial intent. And if you have all these three together, now you've got this system that has been working for tens of thousands of years. You leave one of these pieces behind and you lose a lot of what's happening, because, for instance, without the drumming, these meditations that one gets into aren't as deep. Therefore, the focused visualizations don't go the same direction. They don't have quite the same impact. If you get rid of the visualization, then you're just in some trance state, this weird, which can be a really cool place, but you're in this place that is basically an out-of-body experience. And if you get rid of the ceremonial intent, now you're drifting again, and you could end up having a bad experience, because without having in certain circles, ceremonial intent is called set and setting. And that's the mindset you go in to the journey with, and the environment that you're in to do it. And if you have the right mindset and the right environment, you could have a positive experience. If you don't, it goes off the rails. So I can go more into that if you want, but that's the basic idea. The drumming is really critical to this. When you take the drumming away, you lose a really important component. So.
Yeah, well, and what are those, like, what have you seen in your research is truly happening, drumming versus no drumming? I mean, I know you're touching on it, but I want to go a little deeper, and just what have you seen in your research? Is it really doing to your brain, to your experience, to have the drum versus silence or some other instrument?
Well, we've done quite a bit of this, and I actually put up a video probably 6 months ago, and you can hopefully include a link in it that I show what's going on in the brain. But the gist of it is, when most of us meditate, this is the majority of meditators. It doesn't matter what kind of meditation you do, a mindful meditation, and breathing meditation, a mantra based. It really doesn't matter. What ends up happening is your brain sinks from the normal activity, which is kind of a chaotic, for most people, chaotic beta activity. Now, beta, I'm going to get into a little bit of science here. Beta is our wakeful normal activity, which exists between about 13 and 30 hertz cycles per second. That's where most of our activity is going on when we're in our normal wakeful state. And we're going to have spikes of activity in different parts of our brain, depending on what we're doing, whether we're focusing on something, whether we're thinking, whether we're moving, anything that is sensory based or thought based is going to be seen in this activity. And you're going to also see some other areas of activity depending on the person. Somebody with ADHD who's trying to focus, maybe there'll be some chaotic theta activity, and theta is a lower state. But most people are in beta, and this would be the predominant activity level. And then when you close your eyes and you start breathing and you do a mindful meditation, for instance, or you do a mantra, or you're just focusing on your breath, or you're any technique at all that would be meditative, your brain starts settling into a slightly slower state called alpha. And alpha exists between about 8 and the 13 hertz. It's just slightly lower than beta. It's still an outwardly directed state. We're still connected to our sensory experience. We're still connected to our outer world. Now, when we close our eyes, we do shut down part of our sensory experience because now our visual is shut off, but we're still very aware otherwise. So what you'll see is you'll see a little bit of a spike in the brain in alpha. For most people, it's going to be around 10 hertz. So towards the lower end of alpha. For some people, it might drift a little lower than that, but 10 hertz is what you're mostly going to see. And what you'll feel is you'll feel kind of an internalization a little bit. You'll feel yourself settling down. You'll feel yourself being more attuned to what you're thinking. You'll be aware a bit of some of the other sensory things. You know, you'll squirm in your seat because you're uncomfortable. You'll notice your shoulders achy. You'll feel all these sensations that were there, but you weren't aware of because you were in a beta state in reaction to the world, because that's primarily what beta is. You get a sensory input and you respond to it, more likely to react to it without any thought based upon association. You know, we are pattern recognition systems that respond to input in a pretty primitive way for the most part. You close your eyes, you get into a mindful place, you slow down to alpha, and now you become more responsive than reactive. Now all of a sudden you have an ability to maybe consider what you're going to do. You're going to maybe be a little more thoughtful. So as you're sitting there with your eyes closed and you're breathing and you're doing your mantra or whatever that you do when you're being mindful, for me, ADHD, I had these racing thoughts come through, you know, and I'd have to tamp them down or put them on a train or whatever people do, you know. But I had a lot of monkey mind, just active, but at least I was settling in. And as you get better at meditating, you'll notice that this, on a brain level, this alpha will become synchronized. So now all of a sudden, instead of this chaotic beta activity that happens where you'll have little spikes depending on how you're reacting to the input that you're getting, now all of a sudden you've got a synchronization. So your brain kind of, as a general area, settles into this alpha state of consciousness. And you know, a lot of traditional cultures call this the rainbow bridge. The idea here that your left and your right hemispheres now are synchronizing, and they're going to synchronize to this alpha state, roughly 10 hertz. And we'll see that universally with the EEG. When anybody meditates, especially beginning meditators, and they do tamp down some of their monkey mind thoughts, we're going to see this alpha happen, this synchronization happening, this leveling out of activity. And that's really powerful. And if this is all you got out of meditating, it's a lot, because now you've taught your brain how to calm down. And this skill can be useful anytime. So all of a sudden you're in the middle of chaos in the world and you're getting anxious. If you can just slow down and breathe, and if you have an opportunity, even just close your eyes and breathe, your brain will learn how to just go back down into alpha, and that's powerful. And so that's what most people do with meditation. Now, if you were to meditate every day consistently, a lot, like say people who are training to be monks, let's use the Buddhist tradition. Buddhist monks might spend hours a day, right, meditating. And you're learning now how to have compassion. You're learning now to get beyond just breathing, but now all of a sudden you're trying to breathe in empathy. You're trying to experience what it feels like to open your heart, right? Open yourself up to being empathetic, to being compassionate. I mean, that's ultimately what you're going for when you learn how to meditate on a broader level. Now, what you'll see if you hook up EEG to these people is you'll start seeing theta activity. Now, theta is further down the spectrum of consciousness. So you've got beta, 13 to 30 hertz. You've got alpha, 8 to about 13 hertz. And then below that, you have theta between about 4 and 8 hertz. And now as you cross that threshold between alpha and theta, your sensory awareness starts disappearing. You start becoming less and less aware of your physical body. And this happens to us, for instance, every time we go to sleep. You'll notice you lay down to go to sleep, close your eyes, you're going into alpha. And what'll happen over time, as you relax and as your breathing slows, your brain will drift through theta down to the bottom end to unconsciousness, to deep sleep. And then a whole bunch of things happen because sleep isn't static. But you'll notice how as you're drifting down, you become less and less aware of your outer world. And there's a point where you become disconnected from it. And that's what we're going for. And that's what happens when you go into a deep meditative state. This is what happens when you get really good experience and you're able to disassociate from your ego, when you're able to disassociate from your sensory system. Now you're drifting into theta. And so on EEG, what we'll see with people who got to that level is we'll start seeing spikes in theta activity. And if you're really good, you can kind of direct that a little bit. You can start seeing not only just spikes in theta or raised activity in theta, you can start seeing a convergence, a synchronization in theta. This is really rare with silence. We've seen it only a couple times. What we tend to see is a raise in theta activity that kind of spreads out across the brain. So some areas are more active at that level than others. And it'll be a kind of a broad stroke of theta existing across 4 to 8 hertz. You might see a wide arc crossing from 7 to 4 before it drops down. And then if you're a really good meditator and you're really somebody who's got a lot of experience and you've mastered that act of empathy, of being able to go into a place of I don't know, the universal love, I guess, would be the best way to look at it. That place where you feel like you're one with something and you're feeling just a level of compassion and empathy that is just kind of growing on you. What we'll often see at that point is we'll see some gamma activity in the brain. Now, gamma exists above 30 hertz. So it's more higher activity than the typical wakeful beta. And it goes from about 30 to 100 hertz, which is fairly high frequency for whatever that's worth. But you'll start seeing this peak, this activity in theta, but you'll also see more random activity happening on the higher end in gamma. And this is really reserved for those people who are really skilled at meditating and have the goal of empathy and have the goal of sending out good vibes, I guess is the best way to describe it. And so when people talk about using meditation to kind of heal the world, for lack of a better way of describing it, that's, I think, what they're trying to do. I think that's what we're going for. If we were going to track it in EEG, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see a little spike of activity in theta, showing that the person's consciousness and awareness is internally directed into this almost unconscious state. But there's something else going on in the brain that is extending beyond them in this gamma, which is, to me, fascinating. This is an area we've been looking at a lot. And just as kind of an aside to go outside of that, a lot of our research has been done with the clinical work that we do with the super fast drumming, 120 beats per minute and 16th notes. By the way, that happens to be the lower end of alpha state of consciousness. And so when I'm playing my drums for somebody to help them calm down, I'm actually trying to get their brain into this lower end of alpha. And I thought that was really interesting when I started looking at the math of it. A quarter note, 16th notes at 120 beats per minute equals 8 beats per second, which is 8 hertz. Because a hertz is 1 cycle or beat per second. And the way this works is a process called brainwave entrainment. So what'll happen here is you have an external stimulus, the drumming. And this is what's happened for tens of thousands of years, by the way. It's not something I discovered. This is something that our brains are built to do. We get a stimulus that has a regular pulsation to it, a periodic cycle to it. It can overwhelm the nervous system. And I don't mean overwhelm by making us overstimulated, but overwhelm in the sense that it kind of takes charge of the nervous system of the brain. And the brain wants to synchronize. And really, when you look at the brain, we are synchronizing all the time, by the way. Whenever we have an interaction with another human being, if we're connecting with them, our brains are actually synchronizing. That's a form of brainwave entrainment. And it happens just by nature of kind of getting into synchrony with that person. The same thing happens with the external stimulus, and this is called auditory driving. It's part of brainwave entrainment. The auditory signal of the drumming will drive the frequencies of the brain. And so if I give a brain a stimulus at 8 beats per second, 120 beats per minute, playing 16th notes, over time, the brain will actually start synchronizing at that tempo. You'll see a spike in EEG activity right at that 8 beats per second. And I have quite a few videos actually on YouTube where I show this happening. Brainwave entrainment happens, it'll happen for nearly everybody as long as you follow certain rules. And those rules depend on the tempo you're playing. But it's a powerful force that is universal. And so if we take the drumming and we start looking at the fact that, okay, and this is where I started with it, is saying, okay, well, this clinical work, I'm playing these 16th notes at 120 beats per minute, 8 beats per second. I see the spike of 8 beats per second. What were the shamans doing to get this deep meditative state? And do we see that too? And so I started playing this shamanic technique, which if you're not familiar with it, let me play it for you real quick.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'd love that.
Well, take 2 seconds, but okay. So shamanic drum beat is really simple. Anybody can do it. And I'm just using a simple Remo frame drum. It's a $25, $30 drum, and doesn't need any special equipment, but it's a 4 beat per second pulse. It's really simple. I'm just gonna do that again. It's as simple as that. Traditional shamanic drumming, everywhere in the world uses that rhythm. There might be some variations depending on the drummer and their ability to play. Most shamanic drummers are not drummers. They're shamanic practitioners, and their drumming is, can be kind of chaotic. Most of the time, the drum is a drum like this, a thin drum with a big head, but it's played with a beater. It's very rarely played with the fingers, but so it'll have a slightly deeper tone. Most of them have a thicker natural skin head, which also gives it a deeper tone. But the drumming rhythm is the same, 4 beats per second, non-repetitive pulse. And so we started playing that rhythm and tracking EEG. And I have some videos that you can see on this. And what you'll see is you'll start seeing a spike at exactly that tempo in the brain, in the listener, right at 4 beats per second. And that spike can be a different height depending on the person. And when we talk to the people about what they experience when we see this biggest spike, is they talk about the same experience that a really experienced meditator who can show that in silence, they're having the same experience. They're feeling a dissociation from their physical form. They're not aware of anything going on in their physical surroundings. They're having an internal experience. And oftentimes those experiences are highly visual. They describe traveling. They describe imagery that is very metaphorical. It is very powerful for them. It's a spiritual experience for them, and we're seeing that spike and theta. And in the very rare occasion, when we ask someone to go in and allow themselves to focus with the drumming. And this would be somebody who is not somebody who is getting that theta to begin with. They're just getting alpha. Okay, here's the way we laid it out. Person, we want them to meditate the way they generally do, mindful meditation, for instance, and we want them to focus on empathy. We want them to focus on feeling a sense of empathy and love for something outside of themselves, something or someone. And then we wanted to see if there would be any gamma activity happening, because that's fascinating to me. And never did we see it in silence. We didn't go and meditate and do those Buddhist monks who were able to do this. That was a different set of research somebody else was doing. But we got the drumming going and got them into theta. And these people who were able to get into deep theta, we also had them focusing on empathy. And sure enough, we started seeing some gamma activity happening, just little waves of gamma happening. And so I think somehow that theta consciousness, that theta state, is a gateway to allowing the higher level gamma to happen in a meditation. Now, we've seen gamma in our clinical work using a double tempo, 8 beats per second, but that's a different approach and it's a different type of gamma. But I think it's fascinating that you can really speed up the effects of meditation for people, that those really powerful parts of meditation, being able to get into a super deep altered state, and maybe having this really kind of cool empathetic gamma activity happening by just bringing a drum into it. And it takes 15 minutes the first time. Interesting thing about this is our brains like to do this, and they will learn how to do it. And so if the first time you've done this, and maybe a lot of your watchers here have done shamanic work and tried to do a journey and were miserable, and they're like squirrely and uncomfortable, and I'm a failure at this, because that's what I was, by the way. Your brain learns how to do this. So the first time you do it, it may feel like you're getting nowhere. And that's really common.
Sorry to interrupt you. That was going to be one of my questions, because I think over the years I've had many clients say that the drumming makes them agitated. Yeah. And I've also had some experiences. I've had really beautiful drumming experiences, and then I've had some that were I was agitated. And so I wanted to ask you, about that, if that has something to do with your brain, or if that has something to do with the tempo of the drum, or what's happening there.
The agitation for most people was a set and setting aspect. Something is wrong with the set and the setting. And so agitation shouldn't happen if you've got the right environment, if you've got the right mindset going in. So we have never seen it anyway. If somebody goes in with a good intent, a clear intent, and they're in a safe place, and the clear intent and the whole environment are conducive to their belief system. My issue when I first did this was that I came from a very conservative Christian environment, and in my world growing up, this was not okay. So it wasn't okay for me to surrender into an altered state of consciousness, because altered states of consciousness were not an okay thing to do. We weren't allowed in the world I grew up in to kind of surrender our will, for instance, except to them. But so to be open, to be receptive wasn't okay. So I didn't feel comfortable doing that. And it took me a long time to kind of get past that. Once I understood the science of what was going on, I was cool, because I'm a scientist. So if you're getting agitated, 95-97% of the time, I would say it's set and setting. Another couple percent of the time is you might have an ADD brain that requires a variation. And this is something I share a lot, and I actually have a YouTube video on this, where I take the traditional shamanic rhythm, and instead of doing a straight ahead pulse, I vary it a little bit. Because the idea here is if you create a random variation, that repetitive thing doesn't become overwhelming. And for some people, especially people with ADD, ADHD, that repetitive thing becomes annoying because we've figured it out and we're done with it, because we've deciphered the pattern and it's not interesting to us, and our brains will shut it out. And if we can't shut it out, and especially if you're in a live drumming session, it's overwhelming, because it's a lot of noise, a lot of sound. You can't just push it away, and so you get agitated from it. And the way around that is to make variations. And there's two ways to do this. One is you could become not as good of a drummer, and so all of a sudden you're drumming. And this is why shamanic drumming works so well for most shamanic practitioners, because their drumming is variable to begin with. They're going to have weird, random accents. They're going to be not quite steady in their 4 beats per second, and it might sound it's kind of like this. I won't be able to do it that well, but it might sound like this. So there's variations on not only the tempo, but the accents. That is enough for a lot of people to not get agitated by. For somebody who's kind of a technician and you're pretty steady with your drumming, you need to start thinking about how to make variations. And what I tend to do is I do syncopations. The brain will fill in those extra notes, and it'll actually hear. And you could do accents and non-accents, or you could do a pattern. I often do a pattern of 5 or 7. That's enough variation as well. So if someone's agitated and their set and setting is good, just vary the rhythm a little bit. That'll do it. And that actually leads to another point, is you don't just have to stick at that deep end. There are other traditions around the world that were using slightly different tempos. Most ceremonial drumming, actually all ceremonial drumming in the world is in the theta level of consciousness. So if you look at a traditional African ceremonial drumming group, and they're doing their ceremonial practice, they're going to be at the higher end of the theta, but they're still going to be in theta. They're probably at 7.5 beats per second. And what's happening there is the brain is able to synchronize through brainwave entrainment at that tempo. And everybody that's involved in that ceremony is then synchronized as well. So now you've got this whole group mind happening because everybody is synchronized at the tempo of the drumming. And that's the power of the drumming. That's the power of a drum circle for a lot of people. Even if you don't play and you're just there and wanting to listen, everybody synchronizes to the tempo of the drumming. And most drum circles today, even the ones that are being clinically run, like in the hospitals and whatnot, they're also at theta tempos, because alpha tempo is too fast for a lot of people to play. So, I'll play 8 beats per second for you. You can hear what it sounds like. Let's see. It's a pretty good clip. And so if you're in ceremonial drumming or your drum circle, you're going to still be in theta. And that's a cool experience, because now you're, again, slightly separated from your external world. And then there's other trance traditions that go right midway between, around 5 beats per second, 5.5 beats per second, which are part of trance drumming traditions, in which case they change the rhythm. Where I was going with this first was, the slower you are in tempo, the more regular the pattern can be. When you start speeding up the tempo, you need to create variations. Otherwise, the brain, everybody's brain now gets like that rare person at the 4 beats per second who says, I can't handle the repetition, and starts getting agitated. One of the first things I used to do when I would do my research presentations, I would play my drum at 8 beats per second without any variations, without any accents. It would be like this. And I'd go long enough for people to start squirming in their seats, because they'll get agitated pretty quickly. So creating variations is really important. And if you do that, you can get entrainment all the way up through alpha. And then you can start playing some other games too. But so this technique is not just for creating a deep meditation. It can be used for creating a mid-level meditation, for instance, that can be helpful for people who do affirmations and visualizations. Say you're doing affirmations to kind of help you stay focused and get stuff done and keep your motivation. If you can get yourself below that typical state of alpha and bring yourself into theta a little bit more, you can program that affirmation deeper in your mind. So playing around in the middle is more than just going into a deep meditative state and going for empathy, or doing a shamanic journey, which is 4 beats per second. Shamanic journeys, as you know, you go in with a goal, with an intent. You're going to go connect with a spirit animal. you're going to do a soul retrieval, whatever variations on that theme that you want to do. It's all down to set and setting, your intent when you go in and your goal for that visualization. So you speed it up, now you can do some different things. So
it's so fascinating. It makes me think about my own brain. Now I wonder about my own brain map, because I think like I do get agitated with the very rhythmic versus the variables. So it makes me wonder what's going on in here myself. I mean, it's so interesting. I have a question for you. I have many questions, but I was really lucky to be a part of a private audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama when he addressed the Tibetan people in Boulder, Colorado. And so because of some volunteer work, me and a couple other women were allowed to be there. And His Holiness speaks very differently to his people than he does to a public talk. And one of the things that he said that just is amazing, and I'm listening to you speak and I want your thoughts on it, is he said to his people, you must understand the science of the mind and how the mind works. And he said, there are lamas in Dharamsala chanting mantras and meditating all day and all night. And he said, it's not going to do any good if they don't understand the science of the mind. He's so passionate about it, and went into talking about the importance of the Tibetan children being educated and understanding how the mind works, and that we all need to understand that. So I want your thoughts on that. And I'd love to know, how has understanding the science of the mind helped you spiritually, and vice versa? How has that impacted you?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I don't necessarily, and I don't want to split hairs here, but I don't necessarily think of myself as really understanding the mind so much as the brain. And I don't really understand the brain that much. The more I learn, the less I know. And so I used to know a lot more, I think, because I was wrong most of the time. I think, but I do think it's important to understand in this context. For me, it's been about what do the variations on awareness, what kind of impacts those can have? What are my goals and how can I optimize that? If I'm trying to figure out a problem, I can use certain techniques to get my brain in the right place to do that. If I'm trying to meditate, I'm going to go somewhere else. The mind, if we understand that for most of us, as evolved as we think we are still primitive beings. We still respond to most things around us in a reactive mode. We're not mindful about how we go out in the world. And I think if I'm going to read into what the Dalai Lama said, I would think that we need to understand what awareness is, and we need to understand that we got to get out of that fight or flight, reactive, primitive brain mode. Most things that happen to us in the day, we react and respond to without any thought. We're based upon any associations we had in the past, and we view everything through the lens of past experience without any thought. And if we can stop doing that, if we can start being mindful about how we approach things and take a step back from that situation that we're in, and be able to maybe understand how we would like to react to it, we'd be more often than not reacting in a much more compassionate way. But for me, that came from all the years of meditating and doing the work that we do here with regards to trying to understand, why is it that when I sit down, my brain keeps going in a circle? Why is it that I'm always finding myself worried about something that I have no control over? Even though I know I have no control over it, why do I keep worrying about it? because that's a loop we get into, you know. One of the early sets of research that we did was in a adult care facility for people with autism. We did 2 studies. We did one in a residential facility where the people were living there. And then we did another one at a vocational facility where people came in and went. And we were tracking anxiety. We were watching how that spooling up of anxiety happened. And this is the way I think we all are, even though we don't manifest it maybe in the same way as somebody with autism might, who doesn't have the language or the self-awareness to be able to speak to it. They're just going to react in a very, in a lot of cases in these studies that we did, in a very aggressive manner. They're going to lash out. And that's what we got called in to look at. And so you start seeing this cycle of anxiety start spooling up, and you can see the behavior happen, whether it's acting out to somebody else or self-injurious behavior, where they're acting against themselves. And where we can shift that awareness by giving it a reason to get out, I go in basically and I play in order to pull the brain out of that pattern, because that is an unconscious cycle, right? And we do that every time we react to something in the world. Anytime we find ourselves having a negative emotion, whether we get depressed, we get angry, we get frustrated, any of the feelings that we have primarily come from this cycle that we get into that we can't break. And if we can break that cycle just by snapping ourselves out of it, in my case in this study, by playing drumming rhythms that were unpredictable, and just even playing the drum in that environment was enough for them to stop and say, what's this? And then they'll settle in and allow their brains to entrain. So I think self-awareness is the most important thing. I think stepping back and saying, what am I doing here? And not immediately knee-jerk reaction responding, reacting to the world, which is what we tend to do.
Yeah. There is, so Nada yoga is sound yoga, and there's all of the theory and thought around the unstruck sound, you know, and the primordial Om. And I've happened upon these thoughts about drumming specifically. And part of this is because my amazing husband's a drummer and I can't help but get sucked into his drumming world. But there's this idea of the silence in between the beats. And I'm curious if you found yourself focusing more on that silence in between the beats rather than the beats themselves, or what your thoughts are even on that conceptually. I'm just curious.
I've never given any thought. I have a hard time putting silence in the beats. I have a hard time, you know, when I'm thinking in terms of what auditory brain stimulation is all about. You need stimulation to make it happen. But, you know, yeah, so what we do is constant patter, right? Even when I'm playing syncopations, I'm often, especially if I'm on one of my other drums that I'm playing, like I generally do on YouTube, I'm always playing the notes that other people might make silent. So, but I'm playing them pretty quietly because I want that patter. So I don't know what I would do with silence. I think I'd probably go a little crazy. Good for you for being able to do it. Yeah, no, my world is very filled with sound. So,
well, it's interesting, even though that you're giving sound to that silence, because I'm sure there are layers to that you know you can't even touch on. I want to get into your courses and into the Strong Institute before we run out of time and all of that. But before I do, I just have to ask this question. I'm just so curious. Have you seen the documentary, The Full Mantis?
No, never even heard of it.
Oh my gosh. So I just have to drop that documentary. And it's something I think I can't help but be a psychic in the middle of my podcast, but your energy, it will just light your energy field up. It is about a drummer. I don't remember his name. He's big in the 70s, but he actually started plugging things into his own body and playing the sounds. And so for you and for everybody who's listening, the full mantis is, quite frankly, he's a self-realized being as a drummer. It's pretty amazing. But I just, listening to you talk, I think you would just find whatever work he was doing, I think you're going to find that you might be very interested in that. So let's talk about the Strong Institute, because you have all these courses and you also do full intakes and work with clients. And, you know, I'm honestly like overwhelmed looking at it because there's so many incredible courses. There's shamanic courses and chakra courses and brain mapping and all these things. So will you share with us, you know, what are some of the things you do and what are some of the favorite things you have that you offer?
Well, the courses are fairly new. I put my first course up in 2016, which is, you know, 22 years after starting to do our clinical work. So most of what we do at the Strong Institute is our custom program. It's called the REI Custom Program, Rhythmic Entrainment Intervention, and it is a clinical program of custom-made brain stimulation audio that is used for people primarily with developmental disabilities, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, sleep disorders, sensory processing disorders, ADHD, which would be part of developmental disabilities. That's the majority of our work, and it always has been. I decided to come out with a drum healing course about 4 years ago because I wanted to start teaching the concepts. And so that goes across time and tempo. The idea here is that we're going to look at therapeutic drumming from around the world, and we're going to look at across history, and we're going to take that. Interestingly enough, if you go across time and tempo, you're also they go hand in hand. So the oldest technique in the world, shamanic drumming, has the slowest tempo. The most I don't want to call them the newest, because they're still thousands of years old, but I guess they're the newest, have more complex rhythms at faster tempos. And so I go across that just to basically show how drumming can be used therapeutically, as well at the same time being able to build somebody's skill level. Most people come through that course are pretty much beginners in their drumming. And even if they're not, they probably have one style they play, and a lot of stuff is unfamiliar to them. So, and then I decided I would make some more courses to kind of deepen certain aspects of what's in the drum healing course. So I have a full shamanic course, but it's not about shamanism. It's called Beyond Shamanism. And the idea there is to take the shamanic techniques, these 3 core components, where you've got the altered consciousness, focus visualizations, and the ceremonial intent, set and setting, and to be able to look at these and learn how to do them, and then tear them apart and say, okay, well, what's going on here? What's the science of this? And then how can we take that and go beyond these traditions to therapeutic applications of, say, reducing anxiety, helping with trauma, helping with focus, doing things with creativity and manifestation and things like that are part of what happens when you visualize. How do you optimize all that? And again, what's happening is you're speeding up the drumming rhythms and you're making them more complex as you go. And then the chakra course is an odd one, because when I started doing this work, this was 1989, 1990. I'd been on the road forever. I needed to find a way out of it, and decided that I wanted to find a way of doing something therapeutically with drumming. And I was playing around trying to figure out where to go. And so I was doing the clinical kind of playing with people, not really doing much with that. And then I happened upon, I actually spoke at a conference. This would have been 91, I think, a Whole Life Expo. I don't even know if they're still around, but this was a conference in San Diego at the time. I'd been teaching stuff through the Learning Annex down there, and I just basic drumming stuff based upon some of the shamanic and some ceremonial things. But I ran into a guy who was a grad student at the California Institute for Human Sciences in Southern California. And he said, we have this device that can track the voltage, the energy through the acupuncture meridians by hooking up the electrodes to your fingers and your toes. And then we have a way of interpolating that data into the Hindu chakra system. Would you want to come and play and see if there's any rhythms that do anything along those lines? And so I sat down and I wrote a bunch of rhythms that I thought might happen. I'd done enough studying with this spiritual teacher of mine to understand what the chakras were, and the way she languaged the chakras about what each of the 7 major chakras were for, for chakra security, stuff like that. And I started looking at the ceremonial rhythms that I had learned with my first teacher. Each ceremonial rhythm was designed to invoke a specific spirit within this tradition. And each of those spirits represents an archetype: power, for instance, or love, or sexuality, sensuality, security, survival, everything that would correspond, by the way, to these 7 chakras, right? And so I started taking the rhythms from these different spirits, these different ceremonies, and saying, okay, well, if this one's about power, then let's maybe look at 3rd chakra and see if it's connected. So I play the ceremonial rhythm for power, and we'd see if there's any kind of change in the listener with these electrodes hooked up. And sure enough, we started seeing some correlations. I spent the summer with him recording people. I basically came up with my version, my interpretation of rhythms for chakras and acupuncture meridians because of what we saw in this device. That became the chakra course and the acupuncture meridian course. Of course, they go beyond that because you start with something. The core rhythms are one thing, but then I like to teach people musicality as well. So I show them how to turn it into phrasing and how to be musical, because playing the same thing over and over again is not very much fun, and it's also not going to help that much. So think in terms of musicality, and so that's where those came in. So
I'm excited. I can't decide which one, but I'm definitely on this bus. I am headed on this bus. What's next for you? What's next for you? What's next for the Strong Institute? We're headed into unprecedented times and I think what I find so fascinating about the last 10 weeks is, at a quantum level, there seems to be changes in our molecular structure from whatever is going on across the planet right now. And I've become fascinated by these changes with our experience with time, our experience with energy, and it's happening at this exponential rate. And so I'm curious for you, where's your science brain taking you? What's happening now? What's next for you?
Well, in 2012, we came up with a product called Brainshift Radio. And it's a streaming music site that allowed me to take what we do with our custom programs and kind of turn it on its head a little bit. So what we did is we created a system where I put drumming music up at different tempos for different purposes. We've got 7 different categories. And then I put up some ambient music tracks, kind of soundscapes. And we built a player that allowed people to mix the balance between the two. And so you're listening to it. Say you go in and say, I want to calm. And the system says, well, what kind of calm do you want? And say, well, I'm agitated. And it'll load up a bunch of music with some rhythm and ambient tracks. And then you're able to then adjust the balance between the two to get the effect that you want. And that was really cool. And that was to me a revelation that we did that. But there was always another piece that I wanted to incorporate. And this is what we're working on now. It's called a brain-computer interface. And what we're going to be doing is we've been spending the last 5 years or so collecting the data on this. What we're doing is we're capturing brain data, EEG data of people listening to these tracks so that we can say, okay, if somebody's choosing meditation, how do we know when they get into meditation, right? Well, we know now what it looks like to be in a meditative state. We don't want just them in just alpha. We want them in theta, right? And so if I have somebody listening and they've got the headset on and they're listening to a particular piece of music on Brainshift Radio, and we can see when they respond. And so right now what we're doing is we're still collecting more data and parsing it down, because we've taken it from 16 channels of data down to 4, because we don't want to have a headset that somebody's going to use that's going to be too cumbersome. We want to integrate with the consumer headset that's out there already, of which there are a bunch that have anywhere from 2 to 5 electrodes. But we're basically been creating an algorithm which is going to allow for Brainshift Radio and our custom programs to be able to respond in real time to what's happening in somebody's brain. So if somebody who's in our custom program, for instance, has anxiety issues, we know what we need to do to calm that anxiety. If they have the headset on and we're playing the music for them, we can see when we're successful. And then we can adjust the music to optimize that for them. And that's what we're going to be doing for Brainshift Radio as well. So if somebody wants to meditate, they put it on and they're listening and they've got all this alpha activity, which is all well and good because that's what most people do when they meditate, but we want some theta. We can nudge them along by different techniques that we use. And then we get them into the state of theta we want, and then we can manage that level through being able to get that feedback. And so that's where we're going with things, is the computer interface.
That's so amazing. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's the fun stuff. So
yeah, because it gives you the ability to really create your experience in a whole new way.
Yeah, and I think, I know we understand that it's going to be a small segment of the people who listen to our music that are going to want to get a headset, put it on, and interface with the computer. But I want to do it, and so we're going to do it because that's my toy. I like the idea of bringing the technology into this. Ever since I played with people in their living rooms, I've always thought there's got to be a way to do this that doesn't require me having to sit in the living room with somebody, that we can bring the technology in. And we've morphed it over the years to the point where our custom programs are all algorithm driven. They're computer software. I don't play anymore. All the music is me playing, but it's assembled according to the software. Same for Brainshift Radio. We'll take the technology to another level. And then from there, I don't know what's going to happen. I've had this idea about virtual trance, of creating community, of being able to really get into these states that you would get into when you were in traditional ceremony or a shamanic journey experience, and being able to do it from our own homes and computers. And I know that there's a lot of club music being trying to bridge this gap right now. But what would happen if we really directed that trance state? How could we have an impact? That would take meditating together to another level. And so,
oh my gosh, it would. Well, and as a trance channel, I can tell you, like, the ability to be able to take more people into that space would be just incredible, because I have students who've studied for years trying to get there, and you really have to just get out of your own way. Yeah. And I have a nice rhythmic dog in the background right now. I don't know what he's doing, but yeah, you're in your own way with, moving into that space. And I'm just lucky. I've just always been able to go into that space since I was a little kid. I just floated away into this space, and it's how I get a lot of my information as a channel. And the idea of being able to take groups of people there, because that's where the self lives. That's where, the self and the light and that space of true compassion, that bliss state, is that space of trance. And from there, you suddenly see the world differently. And that's what we need right now. We want everyone to see the world from a compassionate point of view, from that bodhicitta, which is what you're talking about in those gamma waves. I mean, that's amazing. I
Yes.
will be watching for that. And it's been just a pleasure having you on today. Time just flies when you're talking about all this stuff, I feel.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you, Lisa. So,
Yeah, I would love to have you back on. I hope you'll consider that because there's so much more to talk about. And I'll get all of this stuff in the show notes, you guys, here on the YouTube channel by the end of the day today. And then for those of you listening later on the replay on iTunes and Spotify, this will also be in the show notes on the apps there. So you'll be able to get all this. I'll get your YouTube information, Jeff, and the Strong Institute. This is a time of, quantum leaps and radical shifts of awareness. And I think what you're doing, Jeff, is creating the space and giving us another tool for our toolbox to get there, to make those radical shifts, to be able to see things differently and make the changes we need to, not just in our own lives, but in the global community, really.
well, thank you. Yeah, I hope I'm watching life change here, and I'm kind of at a loss as to what's happening. So it'll be interesting to see where it ends up. So.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. And just your work's profound, I think. And I hope everyone listening connects into the Strong Institute. And Jeff, I appreciate you so much. I appreciate you being accessible and taking the time. I mean, it means a lot. And there's a lot of work to do. So you've got some great tools to kind of jump folks forward in their practice so that they can make changes faster. So thank you so much for everything you're doing and for being on here today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's listening and watching. And again, we will be back actually with one more interview today with Satyam talking about why yoga works. So between the three of you guys today, Jeff, we have a pretty good shift in our physical and our mental space today. So again, thank you so much. Thank you everybody out there and have a great day. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.